So several years ago, a group of researchers in the United Kingdom conducted a series of studies with a particular flock of sheep. And one of their initial discoveries was that sheep have the capacity to recognize the faces of up to 50 other sheep. In other words, within any given flock, a sheep can recognize and distinguish between 50 of his or her closest friends. Now, when you think about it, this is quite remarkable because if you and I look around this room at the many faces surrounding us, we see that there are substantial differences. But have you looked at a sheep? Sheep pretty much look like sheep. But evidently to other sheep, they can tell the difference. Now, after this initial finding, researchers conducted a follow-up study on sheep anxiety. I didn't know there were anxious sheep, but apparently there are. And so they decided to study this flock of sheep that was exhibiting anxiety and stress. And the first thing they did was to hold up pictures of random sheep, not from their flock. And when these anxious sheep looked at the random pictures, nothing happened. Nothing changed. But when the researchers held up a picture of a sheep from their own flock, a familiar face, one of the sheep's 50 closest friends, they began to relax a bit. Their blood pressure went down. Their heart rate decreased. But when the researchers held up the picture of the shepherd, all of the physiological symptoms related to stress and anxiety returned to normal. And the sheep were completely calm because the shepherd was close at hand. So this scientific study that took hundreds of hours and millions of dollars essentially told us what Jesus declared to us 2,000 years ago, that sheep need to be in the presence of their shepherd. This brings us, of course, to our gospel reading this morning from John chapter 10, in which Jesus famously declares, "I am the good shepherd." Now, the image of Jesus as shepherd is one of the most well-known and beloved images of Jesus in the entire New Testament. It's an image that has possessed significant sentimental value for generations of Christians. But it's important for us to know this morning that in this particular passage, what's happening is anything but sentimental. Jesus is actually standing in front of the religious leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes, those who are opposing him, those who are seeking his life, and he is making a powerful prophetic pronouncement. Jesus is actually making the claim that he is the fulfillment of promises given to God's people for hundreds of years through the ancient prophets of Israel. You see, if we step back into the world of the Old Testament for a moment, what we discover is that the leaders of Israel were charged with the care and protection of God's people. They were essentially shepherds over God's people. And yet they consistently turned their backs on the people of God, consumed by greed and power and corruption and deception. And as a result of the failure of these earthly shepherds, God's people were scattered into exile, separated from one another, separated from their homes and their land, separated even from a sense of God's presence among them. But in the midst of that pain and isolation, God raised up prophets. Prophets like Ezekiel and Micah, prophets like Jeremiah and Elijah, and these prophets began to speak of a time when God himself would come and dwell among his people as shepherd. In fact, the prophet Isaiah offers us an amazing image of God as shepherd when he describes God as the one who picks us up like a lamb in his arms and holds that lamb close in the embrace of his love. Just picture that for a moment. This image of God holding the lamb is an image that reminds me of a time when my middle son was about a year old. He's now 6'3". But when he was about a year old, he was at that stage in church when he would do anything to get out of the reach of my wife and make a beeline down the center aisle because he wanted to get to his dad. On one particular Sunday towards the end of the service, he succeeded. Now, in my wife's defense, who's here this morning, this was the only time that he succeeded. But he slipped out from under the pew, ran down the center aisle. I was just about to give the final blessing behind the altar, and all of a sudden, much to my surprise, Parker appears around the edge of the altar. And I did what any dad would do. I picked him up, held him close, gave the blessing, and finished the rest of the service with my son in my arms. I think that's what Isaiah is talking about when he said that God would be our shepherd. God is the great shepherd of his people who would come and seek out those who were lost. He would gather those who had been scattered. He would bring healing and renewal to those who had experienced pain and separation and isolation. The ancient prophets of Israel knew that God's people desperately needed to be restored to relationship with God. And so along comes Jesus, standing before the religious leaders of his own day, standing before those who were seeking to kill him, and he boldly declares, "I am the Good Shepherd." Jesus knew the prophecies of Ezekiel and Micah and Jeremiah. He knew the promises that God had made to his people, and he came to dwell among us as the fulfillment of those promises. He came to seek out and save those who were lost. He came to gather those who were scattered and isolated. He came to those who were alienated, those on the margins of society, and offered them not just life, but as we heard this morning, abundant life. Jesus, my friends, was so passionate in his pursuit of those who were lost and scattered and isolated that he was willing to lay down his life. Because, of course, that's what good shepherds do. They lay down their lives for the sheep. When pain or danger or persecution come, the good shepherd doesn't abandon the sheep. That's what the hired hand does. That's what the religious leaders had done over and over again, but not the good shepherd, not Jesus. Because Jesus knows that sheep need to be in the presence of their shepherd. And so I would invite you to take a moment with me this morning and think about the world in which we live. Take a moment to think about your life, your family, your community, St. John's. I think we can agree that our world, like 2,000 years ago and like the time of the prophets, is still reeling with division and separation and isolation. Families torn apart by addiction and violence, communities divided by politics, religion, race, economics, and the list goes on. Many of our youth and young adults are isolated and struggling to find meaning and purpose in their lives. We desperately need a good shepherd. And we as the church desperately need to be formed as a community of disciples who not only follow Jesus, but who embody the character of Jesus, who is our shepherd. We are called to be a community that seeks out those who are lost and scattered and draw them back into the fold. We are called to be a community that offers healing and renewal and protection for those who are isolated and broken. We are called to be a community that embodies the shepherd ministry of Jesus. This week I heard the story of a young girl who was asked to memorize and recite Psalm 23 in front of her congregation. She got up in front of a few hundred people and boldly declared, "The Lord is my shepherd, that's all I want." Now, she may not have gotten the text exactly right, but she nailed the theology. Sheep need to be in the presence of their shepherd. We need to be in the presence of the one who laid down his life for us, the one who died and rose again for us, the one who seeks us out when we are lost and scattered and isolated, the one who, when he finds us, will never, ever let us go. Amen.